So we're going to look at getting some reporting data out of there and then looking at some practical examples for how you can actually action some of that feedback that you're getting into practical things in the system. And then finally look at how we can take that data that we're getting and put that in the hands of the stakeholders who really care about it. So yeah, I have a slide here about why measurement matters, but I really think Jana did a really great job this morning talking about it, because we can measure completions and whatever else that we want, but ultimately it's the narrative behind these things that's really important. Completions are important, they're easy, but they're not the only thing. They're not the end of the story. We want to figure out how those completions actually tell us what we need to do, what we need to improve, and what success we are actually able to achieve from the platform we're trying to improve. The second one is measurement super important for us as administrators of the content to make sure we know what changes need to happen. So if we know that people are getting to a certain point and stopping, if we know people aren't engaging with the content, let alone learning from the content or delivering impact from that content, we really need to figure out what we can do to the content to sort of get that result. And then finally, obviously the leaders and other stakeholders, they want the evidence of success. We need to figure out how to put it in their hands. So roughly I'm breaking it into 3 different sections: tracking, iterating, and sharing. So we'll go through those step by step. The first one is tracking, engagement, and uplift. So I broke this into 3 different sections: engagement, effectiveness, and impact. I think, again, Jana did a really great job talking about impact, where it's about making sure we understand the capabilities that are improving, how people are actually able to change their behaviors to develop the things that they've learned. But ultimately, we can't expect them to do those things if they aren't actually engaging with the content, and also the content is effective at teaching them these things. So we've got to start with the first 2. Are people actually doing the content? And ideally, are they enjoying doing the content? Is the content usable? And the second one is about effectiveness. Are they learning what we want them to? And then obviously impact is, are they then able to put those learnings into practice to improve the business goals and the business success? So hopefully those are the high-level things of what we're trying to track. Then the question is, how do we actually measure those things? So obviously engagement, we're looking at behavioral data. What are people doing with the content? They're interacting with it, they're making progress, they're completing activities, they're getting an overall completion, they're doing the content again, they're filling out feedback forms. That's sort of the really basic high-level stuff of how we can track engagement as a behavior. Effectiveness is actually a step beyond that. It's about system results. So we can do things like assessment to make sure they're actually adopting the learning practices that we're giving them. We can do things like looking at self-rating or any other feedback that we're getting. Or finally, we can look at manager validation. So obviously, once someone does a piece of learning, we want to make sure they are actually taking that back to their workplace, back to their day-to-day. And the manager is the first point of call of someone who can actually validate that. And then finally, the hardest one is impact. We want to look at post-surveys, more manager validation, and capability results, because we see that as a really clear way to align. People are doing a content, and then people are improving in their day-to-day with those capabilities. Again, I agree with what Jana was saying this morning, that the narrative of the impact is super important. Sort of counterintuitively though, I'm going to focus a lot on the first 2, because I'm talking about practical situations in Acorn that can make gathering those data really easy, so then we can spend the important amount of our time actually turning that data that we are gathering into that narrative, into that impact story. So we can hopefully gain in the engagement and the effectiveness information is actually really straightforward. And there's a bunch of different ways we can do that in the system, which is what I'm going to show you now. Basically, I was going to go a bit of a demo of Acorn. Apologies to the people at the back who can't see the screen very well. I'm going to try and talk through it a lot more, so hopefully you can follow along from there. But basically, I want to talk about engagement and effectiveness, how we can measure those things. Starting with widget dashboards, looking at a couple of different reports and how they can give us indications of people's behavior. And then finally going to feedback forms, because obviously behavior is one thing, but people actually telling us what they think is a whole another level of value. I'm going to base this off the same example that Cormac was running this morning. This leadership development program that we've launched has 5 pieces of content. Each of those are going to have different levels of engagement, different pieces of information about them. And we as the L&Ds who are sponsoring this project, who are trying to make this a success, need to be able to figure out, is it working? How are people engaging with it? So if we wanted to, we could run individual reports on each one of these pieces of content. We could drill super narrowly into how people are interacting with SCORM results. But ultimately, the first thing we want to do is get a very high-level picture of what's going on. So we're going to start with a dashboard. Cormac showed this a little bit earlier with the different manager type dashboards. We can have like a homepage dashboard for individuals. In the same way, we can actually have a specific reporting dashboard that's really great for us. So right now, actually I might show you that one first. When I go into reporting, I will see a pretty basic dashboard around overall completion. We can look at popular capabilities. We can see how much people are engaging with the system as a whole. This is great for high level, but if we want to drill into what this particular leadership development program is doing, it's probably better off to make a brand new dashboard and have that available to be viewed as well. So if we look at the widget dashboard page here, I've already set one up with a different layout. And basically what I've done is I've tried to break it up into the 4 of the 5 different pieces of content and just a basic course progress widget that shows us the percentage of people engaging with the content. So for example, the first one, it has 75% of people in progress, 12.5% people completed, and 12.5% people who haven't even touched the content yet. Basically the way we do that is it's a pretty basic widget. All we have to do is target a cohort and a course. So obviously we don't care as much if random people are doing this great leadership management program. What we really want to do is make sure our managers are doing that. So we've already set up a cohort that holds those managers, so we can then target the content specifically to them, but also we can target our reporting specifically to them. So we don't get overwhelmed with the thousands of people who aren't engaging with the content, that the content isn't really for. It's fine if they do, it's available, but ultimately we want to make sure that the managers who we actually are targeting this content for are able to engage with it. And then obviously we can do one for each course. And that means that we have a dashboard like this that at a glance we can see high-level information about how people are engaging with our content. For example, the candid feedback one, everybody's loving it, everybody's enrolled and complete. Some of the other ones, what's that middle one? The delegate course is not getting many people enrolling into it, whereas the better one-on-ones is actually a lot of people are getting started but not getting over the line. So those kind of behaviors we can actually start to do stuff with. That's what I'll get into the next section. But for now, this is just a really high-level dashboard that will give us the information on this program. And these dashboards are really easy to set up. They're really easy to get access to. We can make sure that the right people are able to see them and just see high-level information. But a dashboard like this is only going to help us so much. Ultimately, we want to be able to drill into the data a bit more. So I think the next one that I wanted to talk about was the course progress report. So this one is specific for a piece of content, and we can then run that. Actually, I might run a report from scratch. I'll show you a past report that I prepared earlier, but I'll show you through the setup process because I think it's valuable. If we search for the course progress report, first thing we're going to want to do is pick the course that we're interested in. Luckily for me, Cormac already set up a category for all the people management content, so I can easily pick the content from the list. If we look at the one-on-one content, so that's picking the content that we're interested in. The next one is, of course, the filters that we're interested in. This is also super valuable because then I can say, I actually only care about our managers for this particular report. I can run a report on everybody, but again, from what Jana was saying this morning, too much data is overwhelming. It's hard for us to tell a good narrative about. So this is really targeted. It's saying this one course, these one group of people, how are they progressing through it? So instead of running this report and sitting here for 10 seconds while it generates, let me open one that I prepared earlier. And this is the kind of result that we get. We see that these are our 8 managers and how they're progressing through it. We can see what content they're completing, what time they're doing things. This will give us some really useful behavioral information. Are people, in this case, doing a bunch of stuff back to back? Are they getting up to a point and then stopping? Are they completing the course? Which of the activities are they doing? And in fact, this actually has a good example. The feedback survey column, how many people are filling out the feedback form in this one? 0, which is interesting information for us to then potentially be able to action in the behavioral stuff as well. That's the sort of what we can do with a progress report and then get some really good data out of that. The next one that we can do is a completion report, because a progress report is really good if you're looking at one piece of content. You can see how people are progressing through it. But if you want to look at a high-level picture of are people finishing the content or not, the completion report is better for that. So if I go back to past reports, let's look at one of these. This also gives us a lovely line of how people are doing it over time. So you might find, I think, in one of Blake's presentation slides, he mentioned that when compliance comes up, that's where you see the spike of activity. You'll be able to see the same thing here. Maybe when the content launches, you're promoting it really hard, people are getting in there and doing it, but then it tapers off. How can we sort of address that? How can we get the last people engaged? That's kind of information that we can run with. And the same thing as before. This then lists our relevant 8 people, more than 8 people. This is actually an example where I didn't do the cohort filtering on it, so there are more users in here, useful information as well. Finally, the other report that's kind of useful in this situation, because we're launching a leadership program with 5 different pieces of content, we can look at a progress through a single course, we can look at completions overall, but we can also might want to figure out how many of the 5 pieces of content are people doing. Are people doing the ones that are interested? Are they doing them all? So the best way to do this is with this scary sounding report, the compliance report. That's the other good thing about data. Some of this data isn't actually relevant. The fact that this isn't a compliance program that we're running this on. We're running this on 5 pieces of content. We don't really care if people finish all 5. We want to look at the data that actually tells us which ones are people doing, and this is the report that gives us the best view of that. So for example, we can see that, yeah, candid feedback, everybody's getting involved in that one. The delegate and the run better one-on-ones both have only one person getting into it, and the other ones have a bit of a mixed result. So this one's great if you're launching multiple pieces of content as part of the same program, and you want to see which ones people are interacting with. This is pretty helpful in terms of what Cormac was talking about in discoverability, because in this case, we can see that the candid feedback one is really getting people interested. Maybe it's because we've named it well, maybe it's because it's what people need. Then we can try and figure out if then the other content need that same kind of uplift. So that's just 3 pretty basic reports and the kind of information we can get about people's behavior. I'll talk about how we can action some of that behavior into some changes in a little bit, but I also want to get into actioning some of looking at their specific responses. So obviously people might behave when they're interacting with the content, they might do certain activities, but at the end of the day, the best way to know what people think is to ask them. So that's why we want to set up a feedback report and then also a template report if we're interested too. Cormac talked about these earlier, so I actually have some to set up. That's a bit scary. The building won't fall over, probably. Yeah, so with a form report, we can actually get pretty clear information, not only about who's interacting with the form and giving us feedback, but then also simple things like a yes/no question, was this useful to your role? So Cormac mentioned earlier, free text means that this kind of chart is a lot harder to get. We'll have to spend a lot more time massaging the data to sort of group people together based on their responses. But if it's just a yes/no, we can quickly and easily get an information like this, which actually tells us a fair bit. Tells us that majority of people who did this thought it wasn't relevant. Maybe it's still useful, but if they're not getting the relevance, then the question is why they're doing this kind of training. So this is the way that we can sort of use a feedback form report to get this information. But another thing that Cormac mentioned was the value of templates. So instead of setting up a custom feedback form for every single piece of content and asking really specific questions, something like, was this useful in my role, is agnostic. It can apply to any piece of content. So if we want to see overall trends, we can actually apply that same template feedback form to multiple different courses and get even better results. So if I show you one last report, sorry, it's all data. I mean, that's what we're here. We can see that overall, the numbers of people who are actually saying this is valuable is more positive. So maybe that one course is an outlier. You can also actually look at the individual submissions. They're all anonymous, which is great, but you should be able to see which content it's actually reporting on. So you know which pieces of content might be the laggards in terms of making sure people are engaging, people are actually getting the value out of them. So you get the high-level picture of, are we delivering good content overall, but then the really targeted one, is this particular course giving us the impact that we need based on the user's responses. So that's sort of basic how we can track information, behavioral stuff. The next step for us as administrators of the platform is to iterate and improve our content. So obviously there's all this great data about how people are using, what people are saying, how people are feeling. What do we actually do with that? I've sort of grouped the insights into 2 different sections based on the kind of data we're getting. The behaviors and then the direct feedback that we can then potentially iterate on. Some of these behaviors I'm sure you're all quite familiar with. Even some of this feedback should be pretty standard, I hope. Things like, this doesn't feel relevant to my job, or you notice trends where people aren't actually getting all the way through a piece of content. I'm going to come back to this one because we're going to go through some practical examples of what we can do to address these ones with some of the cool functionality within Acorn. But ultimately, the value of this is turning those insights, the feedback and the behavior, into improvements for the platform. To go back to our content to try and figure out what's working, what's not, and then make changes to it to sort of improve that. We want to improve the visibility. That might be as simple as people finding that a hour-long video is not very engaging, so might want to split up into multiple parts. A SCORM package has a bit inside it that's broken. You might want to make sure that that is able to be fixed. But also things like making sure the content is specific for people, that they're getting value out of doing the training for their specific roles, and also more touch points. So there's only so much that we can do in the LMS, as much as it hurts me to say. Some of these things will need to happen outside the system, be it coaching, be it additional check-in points. Those are going to be really valuable that we can add points into Acorn to sort of encourage those things to make sure that the learnings are actually turning into impact. And basically, we can do this with a whole bunch of things, cohorts, restrictions, completion criteria, workflows. I'm going to go through a couple of practical examples of like what we're actually seeing in this system, some assumptions that I'm making on some of the behavior and feedback, and how we can actually use some features in the system to make some improvements. So starting with the first one, users starting but not completing the content. Pretty standard thing, I imagine. You might make a great new course with about 6 different activities in it. In fact, if I go and try and find one, we can see that this course is set up pretty standardly. There's different sections within it. There's the foundational information. There's an e-learning module. Then there's a quiz to do the knowledge assessment. At the end, there's a feedback form. So we might, in fact, if we go back to the dashboard, I'm pretty sure that, yeah, this is a perfect example of this, where this Run Better one-on-ones, most of our group have actually enrolled in it, but most of them haven't finished it. So the first thing we could do there is try and figure out what's actually the cause of this behavior. And in this case, we should probably start with a progress report because we're starting with something specific. So if you go back to this one, yeah, we can see in this progress report that the one person who's finished it, good job, Chloe, but everybody else got up to the e-learning module and are not complete. That's the kind of behavior that we can action. Like we can decide that this SCORM module has a problem with it. Maybe people aren't able to complete it. Maybe it's too long, too daunting. Maybe people think that they don't have time because they open it up and it says this is a 15-step SCORM and they might be a bit daunted. So yeah, that can quickly and easily tell us this progress report is giving us information as to why that behavior is occurring. The next one is users aren't starting the content at all. I think if we go back to the dashboard, I think my data was set up. Yeah, delegate with clear ownership had a lot of people not engaging with the content at all. So this might be a perfect example for going back to Cormac's best practices for making sure that the course is well named, making sure it's easily presented to people so they know how to find it, they know what the value is from it, they're able to quickly get into it. So we might decide that this particular course, super valuable, but needs more promotion to sort of get that problem, to sort of turn that behavior into something more positive. And then finally, completions take a long time or are really fast. So one of these will go into one of the feedback points, but completions taking a long time is probably pretty standard. Ultimately, sometimes our learning can feel like a fair way down the priority list for our users of the platform. So it's up to us to try and figure out how we can break the content up, how we can make it more engaging, how we can try and shorten it, split it, whatever we need to do to get people in and actually engaging with the content in a timely manner. The going too fast one I'll talk about when we get to the bottom one, the I've done this content before. But some of this feedback, it's a bit generic that we might be getting, but there's often a story behind what's actually going on. So the first one is a classic. I got stuck. I wasn't sure what to do next. This is actually very similar to the first behavior, user starting but not completing. We can run that same progress report as we had before and then figure out where are people getting stuck. Something like I'm getting stuck might feel from the user like they're giving good feedback, but for us, we need to know specifics. We need to know where they're getting up to, what is actually causing them to stop, and we can then take that feedback and then look at the behavioral information from things like the progress report and try and figure out why that's occurring. The next one is probably the most common. This doesn't feel relevant to my job. So someone's been asked to do a piece of training, for example, the leadership module. There's a course in there that tells you how to have really great one-on-one conversations with your staff. Some people might feel that's not relevant. The most common place I think that comes from is not being specific enough. Now, obviously, we are making content that's for the wide breadth of our organization. There's obviously lots of people with different perspectives within that. But what we can do in Acorn is actually something quite clever using cohorts. That means that we can get targeted information to specific people without disturbing other people with some high-level stuff. So in this example, let's say that there's one of the pieces of manager training we're giving to all of our managers, but there's a group in our organization who provide manager, supervisor level support to external participants. from our organization. So they're required to like work with them. They're not actually full employees, but they sort of sit within the platform. So a lot of the manager conversations around performance review and these kinds of things might not strictly apply. So these people might be told that they need to do the content because they are managers, but they're missing the really critical information for them specifically. So what I've done in this case is let's go and have a look at this Better One-on-Ones and Follow-Ups course as our example. And what I'm going to do to this one is I'm actually going to add an optional section to it that's really for those people. So if you go into the course, we can obviously add a bunch of new activities, but if we were to add a new activity that's just for these people, we get a new set of people saying, hey, this content is irrelevant for me either, it's only for this small group of people. So what we can do is we can add a new section, and we're going to call it, let's call it External Managers Supplemental Information. I'm not actually following Cormac's best practice of using words that people use. So we make a new section here, and we can add a piece of content to it. In this case, I just have a pretty basic resource. My help text is getting worse, but I'm just going to upload. No, I'm not. It was here. I have a special guide for external employee managers. So this is information for them that's really great for them and only them. So if I make this activity, it's going to be great. They're going to get the information, but then other people might be a bit confused. What we can do for this section of content is actually cohort restricted. So we can say that only people in our external manager cohort, external team cohort are going to see this. In fact, we can even go one step further. We can say manager. Yeah, we can. Cool. We can say you must be both a manager and in the external team in order to see this entire section of content. And we can add as much in here as we want. So we can add just one basic PDF and make it quite easy for them to understand. Or if we want to have additional knowledge assessments, we want to add one section per every part of the business. That's probably overkill. So we really need to be targeted with some of these changes. But the last thing we can actually do is for these people is this is currently an optional activity. We can, after this activity launches, we can go in and update the completion criteria and add this as a required activity, which sounds like it goes against what I just said of this being optional, but Acorn is smart enough to realize that not everyone sees this activity, and if you can't see it, it's not actually required for you. So you can have one course with a whole bunch of different activities, and everyone only ever sees one, and that's the one thing that's required for them. So you can actually use these completion criteria to set up something pretty complicated from our side, really targeted, really great for giving people the information that they need within the content. But from the user side, it looks like, and that's only three things. It's the intro, something that's great for me, and then a feedback form. That's it. So the only important thing for here is that when we are updating this, we should think about this scary looking page. We've launched this program, so we don't want to remove people's completions, so we're just going to go with the retain option. So that anyone who's already done this will have what they want, but any new people going through will now be able to see that new piece of information, and if they're part of that external team cohort, they're going to be able to see that this is required for them. So that's a straightforward way that we can give people some targeted information. We don't have to change our main thrust of what the content is trying to achieve. We just add a little bit of extra on for a specific group of people who maybe need them extra support. Speaking of extra support, what a great segue. The third piece of feedback that we might get, again, I think Jana mentioned this one, about confidence. Someone might have finished the learning, particularly for something like a manager training program, where they're being asked, potentially for the first time, to get into one-on-one conversations, to give people hard feedback. That's a really challenging thing for people to do. It's really, I would say it's impossible to learn purely theoretically. So you can do as much training as you want, but until you get in the room, someone might not feel confident in actually delivering these particular skills. So ultimately, their confidence, because they're a new manager, might not be as strong just after completing this content. So in that case, obviously for someone who's a brand new manager, we can give them as much training as we want, but the practical stuff is what's actually going to help. So in this case, I think the best way to solve this is actually to give them a prompt to go into a coaching thing with their own manager. So the way we could do this is by a workflow. Most of you are probably familiar with workflows in terms of compliance, their refresher, their expiry, stuff like that. There's other workflow types too, including one that is called an email workflow. Email workflow is really straightforward. When a user does a thing, send an email. but it's really valuable to give people potentially an extra push to do something outside the LMS. In this case, what we probably want, let's do it. Okay, when a course is completed, we want, let's do completion. We want an email to go to their manager, supervisor. I'm using the wrong word. Great, and we can restrict this to a cohort that we make called new managers. So then we could figure out which of our managers are actually within the first 6 months of them being managers, and then we can apply this workflow to the content and make sure that once any of those people complete their piece of training, their supervisor is going to get an email saying, hey, one of your people just completed a piece of training. That's great, but we think it's going to get more impact if you give them something coaching to do. Or next time you have a conversation with them, make sure you ask them about this piece of training and say, was it good? How did it go? How can we put those skills into practice in an actual practical way rather than just focusing on the theoretical? And with any of our workflows, we can set this up once and then apply it to all of our pieces of content. But yeah, this is just a basic email workflow. Again, course completion sends to the person's supervisor, and we can add it to be fully custom text. So this is a really good way to give the supervisor or any of those new managers the opportunity to instill that confidence that the person, based on their hypothetical feedback that I made up, is lacking. And then finally, another one, probably why people are skipping through the content too fast, is they feel like they've learnt this stuff before. So for example, this is particularly relevant for like refresher training or the like stuff they have to do every single year. Part of us wants to make them do the entire thing all over again to make sure they remember all the bits. Part of them says, I remember nothing's changed, I did this last year. And so there's something that we can do inside the content to really address that feedback and sort of have the best of both worlds. So if I go back to the course, so I think the way we set up this course was we had the introductory information, we had the SCORM, which may be long or short, and then we had the knowledge assessment step. And then obviously our cool new piece of information and the feedback. But there's a setting inside here that I don't think a lot of people are familiar with, which is why I'm talking about it, is the ability to have activities that are only visible to people based on whether they've completed this content in Acorn before or not. So for example, in this case, the resources at the top, they're great. We should always make sure people revisit those. The SCORM is probably the thing that gets into the most detail, into the most depth. But ultimately for us, we want people to do the knowledge assessment because we want to make sure people are actually learned the skills. And if they're able to pass the knowledge assessment, that probably means that they have the skills to actually understand. They've made that learning. So what we can do for the e-learning module itself is if we edit it, there's an option to, no, oh, I'm updating the wrong thing. Sorry, let me change the quiz instead. Yeah, course completion prerequisite. Again, that's a classic example of us calling something that makes sense for us, less so for other people. But basically, the drop-down helps explain it way better. You can make the activity only available if they have a previous completion or not available if they have a previous completion. So in this way, the same way that I mentioned with the cohort or restricted stuff, you can have a fairly complicated e-learning module from our side because we see everything. But from a user, they'll go in and see the same number of activities, but it might be different activities whether or not they've done this particular content before. So in this example, let's say the knowledge assessment can, no, what's a better example? Having a SCORM with an inbuilt knowledge assessment is pretty standard. You want to make people go through, understand, look at the videos, whatever, and at the end of it, you ask them a bunch of quiz questions. For someone doing the same content again, all of that pre-stuff before the actual assessment is kind of redundant. So what you can do there is have the full SCORM with the knowledge assessment for their first time. So only available if they have not available if they have a previous completion. And then you also have the quiz standalone as you can just do the quiz if you've done this course before. Because we can assume that you know this stuff. Of course, if you fail the quiz, then yes, you need to go back and do the SCORM again. But ultimately, that's sort of the way that we can tailor the content to address some of this feedback, give people very different and tailored flows to sort of make sure that we're giving people the right content, that they're focusing on the important stuff about learning the content rather than just doing all the busy work. Yeah. So those are all the examples of feedback and behaviors that I had to show off some of those features. I do maybe want to come back at the end if people have any common feedback that they get, and maybe we can brainstorm ideas about how we can change content to sort of address that. But what I want to do next is I want to talk about the final section, sharing the success of our program. So we've had a look at a bunch of reporting. We have a bunch of really great information, great data. We love data. We've used that data to make changes in the content, so we're able to make sure that the content is delivering a better result. Now we have a great result. We need to share it with people who are interested. And of course, that comes down to getting this information to the stakeholders. Now, stakeholders is a broad term on purpose because there's a whole lot of people who want different data for different reasons. So unfortunately for us, we have to figure out what makes sense for who and when and in what format and all this other stuff. So it gets very complicated very quickly, but I'm hopefully going to be able to show you a couple of different ways you can get the information to people so you guys can make the judgment call of what does this person need, how can I tell the narrative of what the data is telling, and how can I give that person the data to support that narrative. But ultimately, people want clean, simple reporting. They want regular insights, so we want to put it on a cadence. Sometimes people want self-serve data. Obviously, it depends on the kind of people. If someone's like managing a piece of content, then definitely. If they're executive, they just want a spreadsheet or a summary or a screenshot of a widget, maybe, I don't know. And then obviously, evidence of value. That's the most important thing. So how do we get the right information to the right people? Acorn has a bunch of different reporting features that can allow us to get that kind of information to different people. So I'm going to run through presets, schedules, and then reporting officer and other dashboards. So presets is sort of pretty foundational to getting the same kind of data over and over again. What we can do with an existing report, so for example, no, I don't like the chart, and this one doesn't look as nice. Let's look at the compliance report. Even though it's scary, look at that big red thing. What we can do is say this report is really great for us to figure out at a high level who is engaging with what pieces of content. So we want to run this one regularly. The first thing we want to do is save it as a preset. And what this is going to do is going to save how I ran the report, what settings I used, what content I picked, what cohort I restricted it to, and it's going to allow me to run a new report based on that exact same filters again and again and again, so I can see how these trends change over time. And if we go back to running a new report, you can see there's an option to use a preset, and there's my preset. I can just click that one run button. It will make a brand new report with the same filters, the same settings applied to it. This is fine for us internally. We are setting up a preset that we can keep running over and over again. But the most valuable thing that a preset can do is be part of a schedule. So schedule reports sit over on the side. It basically allows us to set up the report to run repeatedly, the same kind of report to run every week, every month, every year, every day, if you really want it to. But let's quickly go through that process. I won't go all the way to the end. What do we call this one? Leadership. Compliance, schedule. We need to select the preset. That's the most important thing for us. It tells us what the preset actually is, just in case we have a lot of presets called preset 1. And then the schedule. So we can say we want this every week on a Monday at 7 a.m. Yeah, it's not bad. Let's go with that. And then the most valuable thing for us in sharing this information is we can set this to go to other users in our organization. So we can set up the report. Let's say there's a business area who is super keen on getting their people into this leadership development training. We can set up a report on their behalf in our account and then have that in a schedule that we own, but sent to them every time it runs. So they don't even have to worry about anything except opening the email every Monday morning and opening up the link to Acorn and then looking at the report that gets run. But for us, we can then control, we can then really support them in getting the information that they really need. So that's great for data that we know people are going to want. If they want it on a regular cadence, if you get the request, hey, someone wants an update on how this thing is going every week, you don't have to run that report yourself and email it off. You can use Acorn to set that up as a schedule. The next step on this is actually giving people access to self-serve reports themselves, because this is great if we know what people want. Some of our stakeholders, they're going to tell us what they want. Some of them will want to discover the data for themselves if they're really keen. So we can actually give them the ability to do that. So the way we do this is by setting up a reporting officer. So this is, we're an admin, so we can do all the create things as well as the report things. A reporting officer is a role within Acorn that can only do the report things. So if we go here, we're going to pick someone The reflection is really bad. We're going to pick Ben. And then we can be really specific as to what we want this person to be able to report on. Because obviously even giving someone who, with the best intentions, access to report on the entire platform is going to be overwhelming, if not a potential privacy problem. So what Reporting Officer allows us to do is give people really targeted access to specific reports, specific content, and specific users. So in our manager case, let's say Ben is really keen. He's actually helped us build the leadership training. He's a subject matter expert. We want him to be able to report on how people are engaging with it, so we can help us with that narrative to figure out how people are actually engaging. So we can say we want only one cohort of users, and that's going to be our managers. Nope, just our managers, not our business development people. We can set only select content. We'll actually pick what the content is a bit. And we can also specify which kinds of reports we want. So in my previous example, I was really leaning on the progress, the compliance, and the completion reports. Some of these are live learning related reports. In this case, we're not actually doing any live learning stuff. So giving even Ben access to them is kind of overkill, so we don't even need to worry about it. And that will allow us to give Ben access to zero reportable content. Let's change that. And then we can look up our specific pieces of content. So what that means now is that when Ben logs into the system, he can see a reporting page where he can run any of those 3 reports, and those reports will then show how those people in the manager cohort are then participating in that piece of content. So this is really great. We can go as far with this as we want. We could not limit this or also give people full access. You can give people basically full reporting access to the entire system if they're really keen and switched on, or we can give people just one report they can run whenever they want based on that preset that we already create for them. And then finally, admin and manager dashboards. Now, I already talked about a little bit with this earlier on with the widget dashboard that we created for ourselves to monitor the progress in this one. However, we can also do the same thing. As Cormac showed, we can make a new widget dashboard for users as they access the system to guide them through. This is great for us as admins because we want all this information too, but we can also set up ones for managers as well in the exact same way. We can set up a brand new widget dashboard. We can fill it with all the kinds of widgets we want. The important bit is when we create a new one, we want to pick the domain, which is basically where it actually appears in the system. So homepage is on the homepage, reporting is on the reporting, supervisor is when their supervisor's dashboard, they get these ones. They'll also get their own custom widgets, so not every widget is relevant for us as admins, not every widget is relevant for people as users when they hit the homepage. So we can then customize that report based on what widgets are available, based on what information is really valuable for them to understand how people are engaging, how people are becoming more effective, and how people are giving us better impact there. Great, so that's sort of the different reporting features. Some of them are pretty niche. They might be able to help us address specific problems when we know what those are, but hopefully they give you ideas for how you can address feedback, how you can get information to your stakeholders that makes it one less email you guys have to send, one less thing you guys have to transform. Hopefully we can just give people the data to support the narratives that we're interested in to make sure that the impact is, I'm not going to say self-evident, but more evident. Because ultimately it's about backing the content that we make. We can set up the best content in the world, and then we need to make sure it continues to be good. We make changes to it. We want to track engagement and how people are actually impacted by it, how they are changing. We want to improve the content and the user experience based on those engagement and feedback impact, as I've walked through. And then finally, we want to make sure we can share the success so we know that other people are really understanding what the content is doing, what it's achieving at the end of the day.